The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Drivers of China's nuclear build-up. What lies behind China's nuclear modernization program? As the country's arsenal multiplies, the Democracy Forum's next seminar will explore the role of geopolitics in shaping China's nuclear policy. To what extent is this proliferation a legitimate reaction to the perceived threat of US hostility? Is China's nuclear expansion policy a bargaining chip in future arms controls negotiations? And how wise is it to view competition between China and the West purely in military terms? In analyzing this critical issue, our expert panelists will examine how interpretation of China's nuclear expansion, and the reasons behind it, may affect the future of Beijing's security relationship with the West. Please tune into our live broadcast for a rigorous and stimulating discussion.
Hello, wherever you are in the world, welcome to our August Democracy Forum debate on an issue that may not have percolated enough in discussions about the rise of China. Oh yeah, we've heard about its expanding influence from the heart of Europe to the small islands in the Pacific. The Belt and Road has become a household phrase, its technology with companies like Huawei, and the theft of technology from Western rivals. We've heard about Beijing's flouting of international norms, whether a treaty in Hong Kong, human rights in Xinjiang, blockades against Taiwan. What we have heard less about is its status as a nuclear armed power, its weapons, its rules of engagement, its arsenal, its capabilities, and what that means for all of us, the drivers of China's nuclear buildup. We have an expert panel to unpack, debate, agree or disagree. Matthew Henderson, Tong, Zhao, Amrita, Jash, and John Erath. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner is following our debate and is deeply knowledgeable about Sino-American rivalry and the Indo-Pacific. A year from now, he might be in government. He's going to deliver his assessment at the end, and as always, to give us the canvas and background of our discussion, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Welcome to the webinar this afternoon, which will uncover the extent of China's growing nuclear-capable arsenal and its strategic imperative, and expose the calculation that lies behind its potential deployment. There is little doubt now that Beijing is engaged in a significant expansion and diversification of its nuclear forces. But we've asked our panelists today to focus on the drivers that have led to this momentous build-up. I'm very grateful that they've all accepted the invitation to share their thoughts with us, and I look forward with great interest to the discussion that will follow. My thanks, as always, to the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this event, and to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role as your moderator. It was in July 2021 that the United States Defense Establishment reacted with surprise and shock to the news that China had launched a hypersonic glide vehicle traveling at 5 times the speed of sound, 40,000 kilometers around the globe. Within a few months, the Pentagon admitted that the People's Liberation Army was on track to quadruple its stock of nuclear warheads by 1,000 by 2030. China's nuclear expansion appears to be shifting towards a much less restrained and more offensive posture, leading the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to claim that, I quote, Beijing has sharply deviated from its decades-old nuclear strategy based on minimum deterrence. Likewise, analysts such as Austin Long suggest that by 2030, China's force structure and posture will be similar to America's and Russia's in many ways. And in November last year, the Pentagon concluded for the first time that China is, I quote, implementing a launch on warning, and reassessed Chinese nuclear capability to 1,500 warheads by 2035, almost as many as the United States and Russia have deployed under the limits of the New START Arms Control Agreement. And giving an interview to the Financial Times, General Mark Milley, chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs, didn't mince his words. I quote, "We're witnessing one of the largest shifts in geostrategic power that the world has ever experienced," he said. In a surprising and unexpected twist, the centenarian survivor of détente, Henry Kissinger, flew to Beijing last month and was greeted by senior Chinese Communist Party members, including Xi Jinping. In April, at the time of his 100th birthday, Kissinger recorded an interview with The Economist expressing his concern for world security. I quote, "China is developing genuine strategic capabilities, plus an economy that is competitive with the United States," he said. "So we're in the classic pre-World War I situation, where neither side has much margin of political concession, and in which any disturbance of the equilibrium can lead to catastrophic consequences." Furthermore, in an allusion to posturing over Taiwan, Kissinger warned that the future of humanity is imperiled by a fundamental lack of trust between China and the United States. I quote, "We are on the path to great power confrontation, and what makes it more worrisome to me is that both sides have convinced themselves that the other represents a strategic danger. And it is a strategic danger in a world in which the decisions of each can determine the likelihood of conflict." Within a week of Kissinger's visit, as if on cue, the Chinese government published a revised foreign relations law. Article 33 states that China has the right to carry out countermeasures against actions that violate international laws and fundamental norms of international relations, or undermine China's sovereignty, security, or development interests. Wang Yi, the recently reinstated foreign minister, who also entertained Mr. Kissinger in Beijing, wasted no time in implying that Article 33 will aid China in its external struggles against unilateralism, protectionism, bullying, and foreign interference, sanctions, and sabotage. Responding to Wang Yi in the China Institute newsletter at SOAS, Olivia Chung warns that although there are voices from within the establishment in China calling for moderation in Beijing's policy towards the West, Article 33 settles on Xi Jinping's position. Beijing will not budge. This implies that the rebuilding of trust with Western countries is not a priority for Chinese foreign policy. Last week, in a further attempt to limit the ability of the PLA to access American technology, the Biden administration announced additional restrictions on United States investment into China's quantum computing, advanced chips, and artificial intelligence. There is a concern, however, that this policy may just encourage China to pour even more money into advanced technologies and so accelerate its efforts to close the gap. Interviewed by the Financial Times, Evan Feigenbaum, an Asia expert and vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, argues to the contrary, that the United States is incentivizing China to indigenize literally everything. Exposing the fundamental nature of the threat posed by the Chinese nuclear buildup, Admiral Charles Richard, former commander of United States nuclear forces as head of strategic command, believes China is, I quote, building the capability to execute any plausible nuclear employment strategy, which he says is the last brick in the wall of a military capable of coercion. He adds, every operational plan and every other capability we have rests on an assumption that strategic deterrence will hold. If nuclear deterrence doesn't hold, none of our plans and no other capability that we have is going to work. And driving home this message, Caitlin Talmadge of Georgetown University explains, I quote, China is not developing its nuclear force for some bolt out of the blue attack on America. It's trying to lock the United States and China into a deeper mutual vulnerability stalemate so that the United States cannot play the nuclear card in a conventional war. And the defense analyst Andrew Krevinovich underlines the essential driver of China's decision to superpower size its arsenal to seek, I quote, nuclear parity with America and Russia. But he warns, parity can be enjoyed by both rivals in a bipolar system. It cannot be achieved in a tripolar system because it is not possible for each member to match the combined arsenals of its two rivals. Any attempt to do so risks triggering an arms race with no possible end state or winner. Well, thank you very much for choosing to watch this webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Less restraint, more aggressive. This interesting thought, parity cannot be enjoyed by both rivals in a bipolar system. It cannot be achieved in a tripolar system. Our first panelist is Matthew Henderson, a former British diplomat with deep knowledge of China and East Asia. He is an associate of the Council on Geostrategy. His most recent work has argued that we must see China as an enemy and that its vision of a new world order is collapsing before our eyes. That doesn't make it any less dangerous. The drivers of China's nuclear buildup, Matthew Henderson, give us your view.
I'm most grateful to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for the opportunity to join the panel for this timely discussion on China's nuclear buildup. I do so as a former scholar and diplomat who worked on China for many years, but I'm speaking today in an entirely private capacity. This problem, as we've already heard, is extremely complex, and it's hard enough to define the right questions to address, let alone to offer robust answers to them. But to set the scene for today's discussions, I will try to identify what I believe to be the core issues raised by this build-up, based on my own broad brush assessment. After that, the other panelists will share their insights in greater detail, with expert analysis quite possibly differing from my own. Put as straightforwardly as possible, the Chinese nuclear build-up disrupts global security structures and poses the greatest threat to democracy, world peace, and stability since the end of the Cold War. The original objective of the Chinese nuclear weapon capability, established in the 1960s, was to provide, as we've heard, a so-called minimum deterrent, defined as no first use, aimed at both the former Soviet Union and the United States. However, for the last 5 years or so, plans have been advancing to increase the number of nuclear warheads dramatically, as well as to update the means whereby they can be delivered, from land, sea, and air, and that includes space. However, the build-up is not happening in isolation. It is an integral part of China's competitive projection of state power worldwide, following the dramatic growth of the Chinese economy over the previous decade. This more aggressive approach has been spurred on by increased political, economic, and technological tensions and worsening relations with America and some of its Western partners, in which I include the East and Southeast Asian democracies. Long before Xi Jinping's emergence as China's paramount leader, the CCP has had ambitions to revise the current world order and enable China to replace America as the supreme global superpower. Famously, Deng Xiaoping said that they should work up to this quietly until the time was right. Xi Jinping has evidently decided that the time is right. He has made this task his personal mission. A single narrative now unites China's exercise of economic, political, military, intelligence, and soft power influence. Xi's goals and deadlines are ambitious. Success depends on victory for the rising China in a classic Marxist-Leninist struggle with declining Western powers. Whether or not we're willing to admit it, China is already actively engaged in this struggle. For the moment, it takes the form of relentless cyber attacks, propaganda campaigns, espionage, theft of dual-use technologies, economic and political coercion, and influence operations, carried out with massive manpower and financial resources. Ultimately, the CCP's power base consists of its military and security forces. Xi's personal missions, fulfilling the China dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, require military modernization up to and beyond the highest capabilities of his Western rivals. Although arguably China doesn't currently face any active military threat, Xi needs to be able to hold foreign forces at bay as he pursues this revisionist agenda. It is an agenda which includes ensuring that mainland China can resume its ownership of Taiwan, which in fact only began in the late 17th century, we should remember, regain control over vast resource-rich Siberian territories, which belonged to the Manchus and were annexed by Russia in the 19th century, and realize aspirations to regional dominance across much of the Indo-Pacific. China's strategic concept of controlling concentric island chains justifies driving forward with military expansionism in the South and East China Seas and out into the Western Pacific. As I suggested earlier, a minimum deterrence nuclear arsenal under no first-use constraint is no longer sufficient for Xi's vision. The expanded PRC nuclear arsenal will sometime soon, add up to a medium deterrent stockpile of ICBMs, numerous and resilient enough to deliver both a Chinese first nuclear strike and a sustainable second wave of launches even after a foreign nuclear retaliation. The sheer scale of the current buildup, combined with the development of MIRV warheads and long-range hypersonic missiles, is already lifting the Chinese nuclear capability to a much more dynamic strategic level. In the late 1950s, we should remember, prior to the PRC's construction of nuclear weapons, the US military argued very strongly for a preemptive nuclear strike on China to neutralize its belligerent ambitions in regard to Taiwan. Despite nearly half a century during which China has built up a stockpile of around 400 nuclear warheads to date, the US continues to offer Taiwan firm, if ambiguous, guarantees of defensive support. However, this imminent step change in China's coercive nuclear capability is likely to intensify debate in the US and elsewhere as to how far defensive support for Taiwan could or should go. China's alignment with the Russian regime over Ukraine creates a further nuclear challenge to the current global security structure. This is the 2 is possible, 3 is impossible theme that we heard of earlier. But it's more practical than that right now. Constraints on supplies of fissile material have been a possible delaying factor in the buildup of China's nuclear arsenal. When Putin met Xi in March this year, an agreement was signed whereby new Chinese fast breeder reactors under construction in Fujian would be supplied with Russian highly enriched uranium fuel. The first deliveries have already arrived. Over time, these reactors could be used to produce large quantities of plutonium that could end up weaponized in the hundreds of new Chinese ICBM silos at Yumen, Ordos, and Hami. Widening our focus still further, a second level of strategic nuclear disruption has arguably already been created by China's involvement with Pakistan's and North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs. Although the use of nuclear weapons in Pakistan is a matter for deeper discussion another time. The fact is that a heavily dependent Chinese proxy does, to a degree, hold India in a strategic nuclear standoff. As regards North Korea, Beijing almost certainly lacks the leverage to influence, let alone control, Kim Jong-un's nuclear planning, whatever assistance it may or may not have given in the production of the devices. But this is alarming enough in itself. But from Beijing's point of view, the very existence of DPRK nuclear weapons usefully challenges the basis for long-standing US security commitments, both to Japan and to South Korea, eroding their capacity to remain a dominant force in what would otherwise be China's regional sphere of influence. What has been the wider international impact of the PRC's nuclear buildup? It remains surprisingly difficult for some Western governments, politicians, business and financial leaders to draw strategic conclusions from the CCP's increasingly open contempt for the rules and norms of international agreements, including structures intended to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the emergence of new nuclear powers. There has long been a Western tendency to play down the CCP's military expansionism, espionage and subversion operations, human rights abuses, breaches of the international health regulations and WTO norms for fair trade, and the like, while pressing on with attempts to nurture bilateral economic relations with China as a pragmatic necessity. This, despite the clear evidence that Beijing uses all these disruptive activities to further its zero-sum agenda of entitled world domination. Despite indications that this unrealistic Western optimism is fading, it still begs the question of what clear and coherent policies ought now be to replace that. On the geopolitical front, much of the West as a whole and country by country still has difficulty conceptualizing China risk in terms of intentional threats to its national and global interests. This makes achieving consensus on shared China policies harder to achieve. Misled by years of PRC propaganda and influence operations, debate around China risk tends to polarize political and public opinion and creates divisions among regional alliances, including Europe and ASEAN. In this situation, it is hard for key Western players to engage the PRC government effectively in an effort to reduce mistrust and manage down the risk of military confrontation. Beijing is now showing a new confidence in dismissing the US as a political basket case with a toxic political culture, as the Global Times recently said, with unrealistic faith in its waning military superiority. Other lesser Western powers are held in even more dismissive contempt. Between the PRC and its Western critics, there is now a worsening negative feedback loop, heightened on both sides by domestic political pressures, sanctions regimes, and basic misunderstanding and mistrust. I will now sum up. For me, the survival of free Taiwan is the paradigm at the heart of this complex, multifaceted crisis. According to some expert commentators, since invading Taiwan would trigger such global and domestic chaos that the CCP could lose its grip on power, Xi Jinping has no intention of doing so. But I argue that this not only creates a spurious sense of security, it completely misses the point. At the core of China's nuclear buildup, I believe, lies a calculation that the West, that is, America, will eventually decide that China is too well armed to risk provoking conflict over Taiwan, and that, in the end, Taiwan will succumb to coercion without a shot being fired. Such an outcome, I argue, would strike a lethal blow against democracy and democracies in the region and beyond. The risk of miscalculations by both sides over the Taiwan flashpoint is arguably even more dangerous than Putin's futile brutality in Ukraine. Thank you.
Matthew Henderson, thank you for that that introduction there, which was very thoughtful and telling, raising questions that, as I'm looking at the questions from the audience, too, seem to be coming together. You might not have these at your fingertips, but could you give us what Russia, America, and China have in their nuclear arsenals, or roughly?
My understanding is that the figure of around 2,000 fits America. The Chinese aspiration is, as we've heard, about 1,500, according to the American calculations. And I believe that the Russian figure, because they were both obliged to fit with a limit under the strategic arms limitation talks, is probably similar to that of Americans. Okay. So we might be looking at something in the order of parity between America and Russia. Delivery systems may vary, and a China aspiration to match or nearly match either or both of them.
Right. And you might not have this at your fingertips either, but what are the engagement policies? China is a no first use policy, isn't it?
That is the current
how's the
arrangement.
US and the others?
Yes, that is the current arrangement on the Chinese side, but it must be said that the resilience of that commitment is called into question already.
Okay, because we have a question from Amit Rana. Would China's no first use nuclear policy hold good if it comes to conflict over Taiwan? You've already told us you don't think that's going to happen, but could you sort of answer that?
Doubt about that is the strongest weapon they have.
Right. Okay. And another one, I think, from Anand Tomar, do the West and China misperceive each other nuclear intentions? Is it these miscalculations that you talked about?
I would argue that principally from the Chinese perspective. The Chinese perspective of what nuclear weapons are for is different from that of the West. As a result, there is a contradiction. It's not really a misperception, it's a different conception.
Okay, could you expand on that just slightly?
Yes,
Give us
yes, precisely. The Chinese political power grows from the barrel of a gun. This is not a state, but it is a party military state. And as a consequence, the actions of the military are the first, not the last, set of moves that the Chinese authorities make. Xi Jinping is primarily a military and intelligence leader and not a civil leader. From this point of view, then, his power is expressed at the beginning of the equation by nuclear capabilities, and acquiring those and having them more strongly devised and aimed better than his enemies is the basic raison d'etre of him and his leadership. That is very different from the role of nuclear weapons as a weapon of last resort, I would argue, in the Western context.
Okay, now that's very interesting. So just finally to sum up in a couple of words, what is the driver of China's nuclear policy?
The pursuit and delivery of a revisionist agenda, first and foremost to restore what is presented as the integrity of the PRC's territories, even though they've never run Taiwan, but that includes other countries as well, interestingly also ultimately regaining control of massive 400,000 square miles worth of Siberia. This requires an overwhelming nuclear capability which can be delivered without warning and in total surprise. That is what they're working up to.
So the driver is to regain all that through the barrel of the gun, as you say, or through the nuclear threat. Matthew Henderson, thank you very much. Stay with us. Our next panelist is from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he has worked on both sides of the divide, as it were. Tong Zhao sits on numerous boards concerning nuclear weapons. He's written 2 reports, big reports on the issue, and is associated with top American universities, while also having graduated from Tsinghua University and having worked with the Office of Foreign Affairs of the People's Government of Beijing Municipality, what I might call a dual-use panelist for our purposes. Tong Zhao will give us an insight into China's thinking on nuclear issues. Tell us what you know.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my views. Given my close observation of Chinese expert analysis on this issue, I think the best contribution I can make to this panel is to focus on the internal drivers of China's nuclear buildup. Because a lot of international experts and analysts tend to focus on the technical level drivers behind Chinese nuclear calculation, which has been the right way to understand Chinese thinking for a long time, because in previous decades, Chinese experts were indeed mostly worried about how technical level threats, such as the development of American missile defense capabilities and conventional precision strike weapons, might threaten the survivability and the credibility of China's second strike nuclear capability. And that had been the primary driver of Chinese incremental nuclear modernization. But I don't think those technical level drivers are the main driver behind the current round of Chinese nuclear buildup, which is unprecedented in Chinese history. If you think about the fact that for decades, China maintained a very small nuclear arsenal of about 200 nuclear weapons in total. But in recent few years, that number has increased to more than 400 nuclear weapons today. The reported Chinese aspiration is to grow this arsenal to more than 700 by 2027 and to go beyond 1,000 by 2030. And if this pace of development is maintained, then the number might reach 1,500 by 2035. But even if we look at if we only look at today's number of more than 400 nuclear weapons, that already has doubled the size of Chinese nuclear arsenal compared with more than a decade ago. So it has been a very quick and massive expansion. The technical level drivers such as missile defense and conventional precision weapon capabilities or space-based sensors, all of those new American military technologies indeed could theoretically undermine a Chinese nuclear deterrent in one way or another. But if we look at what China is doing today, including its focus on the development of large-scale silo-based nuclear ICBM sites, those silo-based intercontinental range nuclear ballistic missile systems, they are not the most cost-effective way to address concerns such as missile defense. So I think the current round of nuclear buildup is driven by a different logic. And also, when Chinese officials and diplomats, when they were asked about the question of why China is building up its nuclear forces, they didn't really point to American missile defense or conventional precision strike weapons as the reason. Rather, they said about the necessity to increase nuclear safety and security of Chinese nuclear arsenal, etc. In other words, if missile defense and other technical capabilities of the United States were the primary driver of China's current nuclear buildup, I think Chinese officials should have every reason to highlight those American capabilities and blame the Chinese buildup on American behavior, but they didn't. So I think the most important driver today is at the political level. And Chinese paramount leaders from the founding of the People's Republic of China have all emphasized the political value of nuclear weapons. But this aspect of Chinese nuclear thinking has received less attention by the international expert community. From Mao Zedong, the first generation of Chinese paramount leader, to Deng Xiaoping, to Jiang Zemin, to Hu Jintao, all of them have said things like nuclear weapons are an important source of China's international status. Without nuclear weapons, China would be looked down by the superpowers, and China would be treated unfairly in the international system. Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, in particular, have said that China needs to develop a nuclear force that is commensurate with China's international status. And in this regard, I think Mr. Xi, the current Chinese paramount leader, shares this view. He wants China to have a nuclear capability that is commensurate with China's international status. However, the difference today is what it means for China's international status today is very different from before. from the perspective of the current Chinese political leadership, China has unprecedentedly narrowed the power gap between itself and the United States. As a result, although for many years the US was not very worried about China's economic development and the growth of China's comprehensive national power, but in recent years, when China started to further narrow the gap to the point that China may take a short time to catch up with the United States, or even exceed the power of the United States. That's when the U.S. became more and more worried and became more and more desperate to prevent China's further growth. That's, I'm simply describing how today's Chinese leadership is understanding this, and not necessarily endorsing its view. But according to this view, the United States and its Western allies, they are driven by the primary goal of preserving their predominance in the international system. And therefore, they worry that continuous Chinese growth and rise would eventually challenge their predominance, and therefore they need to use everything possible. They need to resort to every measure possible to slow down China's growth, to disrupt China's development, and to create troubles for China. That's how Beijing interprets the reasons behind growing Western criticisms against China on issues like Xinjiang, Uyghurs, Hong Kong, domestic political suppression, etc. China doesn't think these represent genuine Western concerns. They think these criticisms are only excuses used by Western countries to achieve their geopolitical goal of slowing down China's growth and preserving their predominance. And according to this logic, the recent rising troubles between China and the US-led Western countries is a direct result of the structural change in international balance of power. And therefore, according to this power-centric mindset, they reached the conclusion that the only way for China to get out of the trouble is to further accelerate the process of power transition between the East and the West, to the point, by the time that China can build and demonstrate overwhelming strategic capabilities, including military capabilities, that's when the US-led Western countries would eventually have to accept China's rise and to accept the new reality that China has already become a leading international power, and there is no chance that Western countries can do anything to disrupt China's growth, and therefore Western countries would have to give up on their perceived strategy of containing China. And in this logic, nuclear weapons and other strategic military capabilities play an important psychological goal, because those strategic capabilities are very important for shaping Western understanding and Western perception about the balance of power. So I think the current leadership, he genuinely believes that if China can demonstrate a stronger nuclear capability, that would considerably help make the US-led Western countries think twice about their so-called containment policy against China. In other words, I think China's nuclear buildup is driven by both fear and ambition. The fear is a result of the Chinese perception that the US and Western countries are increasingly using extreme and desperate measures to deliberately undermine China's core interests, such as to threaten China's internal stability, to promote color revolution, to demonize China's political system, to demonize China's ruling party, in order to create troubles for China. So China is increasingly embracing an existential threat perception about Western intentions. I don't endorse this perception, but I think this is how Chinese leadership is understanding the development. And as a result, because of this increasing existential fear, existential threat perception, they think China has to demonstrate much stronger strategic capabilities in order to disabuse the Western powers of their attempt and interest in undermining and threatening China's core interest, including regime security and political security. So that's where Chinese ambition came from. The ambition to demonstrate greater strategic capabilities is a direct result of the rising existential threat perception, or in other words, both fear and ambition are actually two sides of the same coin from the Chinese perspective. And I think the international community needs to understand both aspects in order to come up with a good solution to deal with this challenge. And as part of this challenge is the growing information and perception gap between China and Western countries because of the decades-long Chinese efforts to systematically control information access and to manage public opinion within China. And this trend has only become greater in recent years under the current leadership. Both Chinese policy elites and ordinary Chinese people, they have indeed developed very divergent understandings on basic factual issues with policy elites and general public from Western countries. Today, the two nations, or the peoples from the two sides of the China's Great Fire War, they genuinely disagree on a wide range of basic factual issues, and that's the basis of their serious distrust of each other's strategic intention. And that's very hard to resolve. However, even though some Chinese officials and experts are better informed in China than others, the number of well-informed people is very small. And even these people, they still think that it is justified for China to promote alternative facts to its own people and to the international community because they believe Western countries have been doing the same for a very long time. So because of their interpretation of how Western countries are dealing with international norms and principles of behaviors, they think it is justified for China to also conduct such information operation campaigns. As a result, everyone in the Chinese system is increasingly influenced by the unique information environment within China, to the point that even Chinese senior leadership, they also take advice and are informed by their policy advisors. But those policy advisors, they live in the same information environment. So they collectively develop and this unique perception about the nature of China-US and China-West confrontation, and their belief in the need to use every means possible, including comprehensive military modernization and the nuclear buildup to confront perceived Western hostility gets reinforced over time. So that's the fundamental driver and the fundamental challenge we are facing today, because we shouldn't assume internal policy coherency in China's nuclear thinking. In an increasingly centralized decision-making system, the experts, China's own experts, are increasingly excluded from internal policy deliberation. If you read the writings and analysis of Chinese military experts, civilian experts, many of them were not aware of China's massive nuclear expansion programs until they were reviewed by international researchers and media. So the lack of internal checks and balances, the lack of basic transparency, internal transparency, is seriously undermining internal policy coherency. And that's one important feature of China's current nuclear policy that we should be aware of. And there is no evidence that China has coherent long-term nuclear planning. There is a lot of speculation about, China has already decided to match US and Russia in nuclear capabilities, which I don't think is supported by empirical evidence. What is likely to be the reality is China probably is adopting a step-by-step approach to develop its nuclear capabilities. China will build up its nuclear forces to some extent, and then it will re-evaluate its international situation and security needs, and then make the next decision, which means the international community still has an opportunity to better understand and influence future Chinese nuclear decisions. Some countermeasures currently being debated in Washington and other places run the risk of focusing too heavily on the military element of nuclear buildup and ignores the political driver behind the program and runs the risk of further feeding into the Chinese fear and encouraging China to make more decisions about a further nuclear buildup. So probably I should stop here by saying that we are facing a much larger problem than nuclear arms race and risk of nuclear conflict, because this is all driven by a broader and underlying political challenge underlined by a growing information and perception gap at the societal level between China and the Western countries, which means we need a whole of society approach to engage with China to mitigate these underlying challenges before we can have a chance to effectively address the risk of nuclear arms race. I will stop here, and sorry for going for so long.
No, it was absolutely fascinating, Tong Zhao, and I just wanted to come in with a couple of questions. Matthew Henderson talked about nuclear weapons and this mindset about power comes through the barrel of a gun. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that the nuclear arsenal and buildup is part and parcel of the whole jigsaw puzzle that China is putting forward to become a bigger global power, with the Belt and Road, with the technology, with everything else. Is that correct?
Indeed. I haven't seen enough evidence to prove that the current nuclear buildup is primarily driven by a specific military objective. Contravenes with China's long-standing nuclear thinking, which doesn't believe in nuclear warfighting.
Are we right or wrong then to define China now as an enemy, which is being done more and more often?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Are we right or wrong, we in the West, right or wrong, to define China as an enemy, which is what is being done more and more often in the West?
I think it's wrong to portray China as a power driven by a deliberate, and a regional aggressive and expansionist ambition. I think it understates the other more important element, which is China's expansionist behavior and thinking is a result of its increasing fear, its increasing existential threat perception, which has its own sources in the internal political problems of China's authoritarian system. So that's the more important challenge. It's not that China just somehow suddenly became aggressive.
Right. Okay. And finally, a question from APS Ratour, and it addresses the point that Lord Charles Bruce made about the tripolar system that, as far as nuclear weapons balance goes. What is the consequences? What is happening with the Russia, China, North Korea alliance in this nuclear weapons sphere? Are they allied? Are they opposed? What is going on?
I think as these countries increasingly share ideological perspectives and values, they develop common concerns about US-led Western countries, and that very significantly influence their thinking about potential military coordination and cooperation, including perhaps in the nuclear area. We already see China and Russia working together on issues like strategic early warning capabilities and missile defense. We see increasing joint Chinese-Russian strategic bomber patrol exercises. We also see, for the same reason, increasing Chinese and Russian tacit support for North Korea. When North Korea is massively developing its nuclear capabilities, Russia and China refuse to endorse UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea. However, I don't think they are engaging. I don't think they are already engaging in very deep nuclear planning, collaboration, or coordinated nuclear warfighting strategies. They still have a lot of distrust among themselves, both between China and Russia and China and North Korea, which I think prevents them, at least for now, from a very deep nuclear weapon and nuclear operation coordination.
So is it or would it be a realistic scenario to have Russia, China, North Korea, maybe Pakistan, with their nuclear arsenals pitted against the US, Europe, NATO, India? Is that something that could happen if miscalculations go terribly wrong?
I don't think we have reached that stage yet. It would take a serious deterioration of their relations with Western countries for them to be able to overcome their historical distrust and their own realpolitik calculation to reach that level of nuclear cooperation.
Thank you very much for that. Stay with us, because this debate is sort of really nailing things down now. We're now going to India, to Amrita Jash, who's coordinator of the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies at Manipal University in Karnataka. She is the author of The Concept of Active Defense in China's Military Strategy and a specialist in China's expansion, especially, of course, from the viewpoint of India. What remains constant in what China's doing, and what changes are there in Chinese thinking? Amrita Jash, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, for this generous introduction. And at the very outset, I would like to thank the Democracy Forum and Lord Bruce for this invitation. Indeed, an honor to be discussing with such esteemed panelists. My fellow panelist has already set the precedent, and I'll directly jump into the pointers that has been asked. That is, what are the drivers of China's nuclear military buildup? In my view, I would like to argue that the increase in China's force size and structure, two factors come to my mind. Firstly is the changing understanding of what constitutes a credible deterrence in a changing security environment. That is, how is China perceiving deterrence in the changing security environment? And the second factor, where I concur with Dr. Tong, that is in terms of status, which I see it as a quest for status. Now, going with my first factor, that is changing views of deterrence. Now, the current situation that China is in is giving that impetus as to what constitutes a credible minimum deterrence against other nuclear armed states. Especially here, I would like to draw, states that China considers adversarial. So United States, and also I would like to bring in India in this. So in this gamut, we see that China appears to be making a shift, or rather, China has made the shift from minimum deterrence, that was the once preferred strategy, to that of a more advanced nuclear posture of limited deterrence. And this is evidenced by the rise in China's nuclear stockpile from 200s to that of now above 400 plus. So this aspect of limited deterrence is very critical, because that brings into perspective what China is aiming for, that is having that sufficient counterforce and countervalue tactical theater, strategic nuclear force that can deter escalation, and also having that capability that is sufficient to control escalation and to compel the enemy to break back down. This is what is the concept of limited deterrence as given by Alistair Johnson. So this is the aim. Now, when I argue or see this change in the credible deterrence perspective, I see it from what has happened. So it's attributed, or China's elevation of its second artillery force to that of PLA rocket force, PLARF, in 2015. So today, China has a designated service, PLARF, at equal status with that of PLA Army, Navy, and Air Force. So with this, China has already streamlined the command and control of China's nuclear triad. So that gives us some perspective as to what, how do we join the dots in terms of the changing understanding or the changed understanding of China's view over deterrence. And we see that from China's white papers also, which suggests, like for instance, from the 2019 white paper, there has been two significant mentions, and I would like to quote, where it says, especially the PLARF, it plays a very critical role in maintaining China's national sovereignty and security. So this is an obvious interest, or what propels or drives China's nuclear buildup. And second is given the strategic requirements, that is, where the PLARF is aimed at enhancing its credible and reliable capabilities of nuclear deterrence and counterattack, strengthening intermediate and long range precision strike forces, and enhancing strategic counterbalance capability so as to build a strong and modernized rocket force. So the intentions are well laid out. So it's clear what China is aiming for. And this exemplifies the shift from its earlier modest approach towards having a minimum deterrence to now having shifted to that of limited deterrence. And this also brings into perspective, because the PLA's nuclear deterrence, in that it sees the PLARF as a strategic support for PRC's status as a major power, and also as an important cornerstone of safeguarding national security. So that's where I see how strength is equated with status. They are going hand in hand in China's thinking. So when I see the upgradation from the second artillery force to PLARF, it explicitly highlights the increasing importance of conventional and nuclear missiles to the PLA's war-fighting and deterrence capabilities. And in terms of even on a conventional level, if we are talking about developing these missile capabilities, it provides PLA more options in planning for regional scenarios, because it's when we talk about the security environment now is much more tumultuous, be it over Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, the Himalayan border with India. So it's several flashpoints where China is engaged in. So this is the way. So it becomes a need of the hour for China to upgrade its nuclear capabilities. So this is a very pragmatic way of looking at, if I have to reason China's choices. The other aspect is that of nuclear deterrence as a status symbol. So when I see it as a status, that means a potential source of coercive leverage and acts as a visible symbol of China's great power status. Now, we also see that what got China into UNSC was also having the nuclear capability in 1964, and that made it that give that entry into that elite P5 club. So status comes with your nuclear paper. It's a given. So China's increasing nuclear stockpile therefore suggests that there's a long-standing policy of maintaining a small and survivable nuclear deterrent is no longer satisfactory for a rising China. Because when you talk of rise of China, it is rising and its power is also is on the rise. So that you cannot have make a minimum deterrence when you're talking about power, because you need to have the adequate capabilities. Let's say how to quantify or qualify that power. So therefore, this nuclear weapons buildup is not just linked to deterrence, but it comes with an added advantage or quest that enhances China's great power status. So, and I would like to draw it from the thinking of former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who once said that additional nuclear force enhancements were necessary to earn more say and a higher international status in a coming world order. So again, this is again a practicality to the choice that China makes. So that goes hand in hand. So China wants, therefore, to be recognized as a major power, and therefore it views its credible nuclear deterrence as a symbol of that prestige that comes along with it. And an important implication is that while there is no conclusive evidence to suggest that China aims to achieve parity with US or Russia in the short or medium term, because the gap is too big. That intention, however, cannot be ruled out when we try to assess China's nuclear modernization program or buildup. As only if I have to go with the thinking, when you gain that parity, it automatically brings China in commensurate status with United States and Russia. So this is how I draw the linkage between strength and status. So therefore, to put it in a simplistic way, we see that nuclear weapons are vital to manage its security environment and to obtain its rightful position in the global order. As that's also part of the Chinese dream that we're Xi Jinping's Chinese, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So status, recognition, great power is there in the mindset. Now, when I put these two factors and I try to study China's nuclear policy, there are both continuities and change. While China is increasing its stockpile, but that doesn't mean that China is immediately charting an offensive policy. So I don't want to jump into that quick conclusion. I would like to suggest that rather, when we see it, that there is a continuity from Mao Zedong, who once called that nuclear bombs are paper tigers. Uh, there was a change in his mindset, and that's where China went for the nuclear bomb. And then we see today Xi Jinping. So from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, the standard policy has been that over nuclear weapons is that nuclear weapons are not a means for fighting or winning war. So that is a standard accepted norm or principle that the Chinese leadership follow in theory. And this was also exemplified in the 12-point position paper that China gave on Ukraine crisis. So they categorically mentioned that nuclear weapons must not be used and wars must not be fought. So this gives us that China still continues on its defensive posture. But now here comes the cautionary tale for us that, okay, it is maintaining it, but how do we assess the future? That's where the question lies. Because Chinese leaders continue to maintain that nuclear wars must not be fought. But China's nuclear modernization, if we read, is suggesting otherwise. How do we read these increasing numbers of stockpiles? So, given therefore the change in Beijing's policy from that of minimum nuclear deterrence to that of limited deterrence, we can assess that in the immediate future, the likelihood of a further change to an offensive nuclear strategy is low. I'm saying immediate future, but in the long term, it cannot be ruled out. So, as of now, China has a no first use policy. But as its nuclear stockpile grows both in size and sophistication, then with these capabilities, China will acquire the first strike capability. So, there is a possibility. So, the transition in the making. So therefore, even if China has no intention at present, uh, its modernization has direct security implications, especially for countries which are at odds with China, be it United States, Japan, and India. And we are seeing that how we closely watch China's nuclear build up, even if United States, the range is too high, but still it creates that unrest or uneasiness uh, to U.S. One of the most powerful country. It's China is still able to create that uneasiness. It's because the intentions are not clear. As the strategic community continues to argue, where's the transparency? Not being able to read China's intentions. And here, Dr. Tong Chao's interventions that look at the domestic, we often give it to the external, but how the domestic is driving becomes very critical in that understanding, because it brings in that other perspective, which are not so obvious. So overall, I would like to say that when we are seeing China's increasing nuclear capabilities, it does indicate that Beijing's intention towards taking a departure from its long-held, modest, low survivable nuclear profile. So we are seeing that change. Certainly, it's uh, the US factor, or the great power competition with US factor is US is an underlining factor in China's shift or needing for deterrence towards making it more limited in nature, and therefore its quest for status is very obvious. China is wanting that, so recognition is key. So therefore strength and status are driving its nuclear modernization, and therefore for China the nuclear weapons are therefore, as I would like to argue, no more paper tigers, and but indeed very crucial necessity for deterrence and prestige. And with this nuclear buildup, therefore, I would like to end with the thought that the risk of a nuclear arms race is real and mounting. And thank you very much.
Amrita, Jash, thank you so much for that great insight there. There's a question from the audience about the region that I want to bring to you, but could you lay out for us? It is correct, is that both India and China have an unequivocal no first use policy on nuclear weapons. Is that right?
Yes.
Pakistan, what is Pakistan's view?
Pakistan doesn't have an NFU policy.
And North Korea?
No.
No.
North Korea also doesn't
So
have.
the big beasts of India and China are firm on it, but Pakistan, there's outliers, and North Korea could launch a sort of. The reason I ask this is that Dr. K.K. Udahai says that with an expanding nuclear arsenal giving China more sway over regional issues, how best might the region react without escalating tensions?
Well, the obvious, going with the pulse, our obvious reactions are always the security dilemma is so very obvious. When one build up, automatically the other goes on building up. But when it comes to nuclear, that's where we have to prevent, because the arms race is not what any country would want. No country wants nuclear war. So we need to be the uh, you know I don't know how much of a dialogue helps, but transparency is the key word. At least, where we always say perceptions and misperceptions are problematic, rather misperceptions. So intentions and getting clarity over intentions and transparency matters. At least now, when we're looking at, getting that clarity that China has, 400 plus gives us some clarity on how do we deal with it. Now,
Okay.
especially when it comes to India, the NFU acts as a boon for us because that creates the debt.
And to what extent is India currently building up its nuclear stockpile? Is it going to try to match China, and then if China matches the US, to do that too?
No, India doesn't follow that mentality of matching or commensurate to that of China. That is not in the mindset. We are defensive in our position, and so our nuclear doctrine is very clear. It's just out there.
And I understand we had this on a previous democracy forum that both India and Pakistan, the nuclear warhead is not actually attached to the missile as we speak. That has to be done and would take several hours. Is China the same, or can China fire at any time?
China has greater sophistication any day. There is no doubt about it. And
Okay.
yes, that's that itself. Because you need to understand that whom is China aiming to match? China is looking at United States when it's trying to build up capabilities, and so that brings in where are you? That calls for the sophistication in your arsenal or inventory. I would call it.
Okay.
I think so. That clarifies or provides the answer.
Thank you. And before I let you go, but stay with us, we had Matthew Henderson's view at the beginning about the fact that China is an enemy, and the driver was the power from the barrel of the gun. We had Tong Zhao's view that actually the nuclear arsenal is part and parcel of its whole strategy. Sum up your driver.
My driver is as simple. I started only with that strength and status.
Status.
So strength, yes, strength and status. So strength comes with deterrence. Therefore, I said there's a complete shift from minimum to limited. So that's why you're increasing the number. And status, of course, international recognition as a great power. I'll try to supersede from major power, but great power rather.
The status needed for a great power. We will nail that to your master at the moment. And now to our final panelist, John Erath, Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C., which he joined after more than 30 years in government, most recently with the National Security Council. Much of his work revolved around non-proliferation, nuclear arms, and his expertise spans the globe. He is going to deter us from thinking of the rivalry between China and the West in purely military terms, because that, of course, invites military solutions, and this debate is about nuclear weapons. I need say no more. John Erath, give us your argument. I see a blank space there. Has John left us? Well, whilst we're waiting for John to appear. We have a question that has come in from Saeed John. You are with us?
It's good to be back. Sorry, I lost my connection for a moment there.
Did you? How much of my introduction of you did you get?
None at all, but I'm sure it was very impressive.
And I will. I'll just repeat. I've just said about that you're the Centre of Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in DC. Worked in government for 30 years, most recently the National Security Council. And you are going to talk to us about that we shouldn't see China and the West in purely military terms, because that invites military solutions. And this debate is about nuclear weapons. So I needn't say any more of that. So John, give us your argument.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a great pleasure to speak on this subject today. It's a greater pleasure to go last when such distinguished colleagues have made all of the salient points. But I'm going to try to use a slightly different angle and perhaps come up with some new thinking on this subject. So when we talk about China's nuclear buildup, the phrase that is almost always used for context is that of great power competition. This is a very useful phrase because it is descriptive of the overall situation. It is descriptive, but it's not definitional because it doesn't explain it all. At the same time, there's great power competition. There's also great power cooperation. The US and Western countries are able to work with China on a number of different things that are in mutual interests. We are the largest trading partners. The financial and business relationships are vital on both sides. When we put too much emphasis on the purely military aspects of the great power relationship, we do a disservice to the overall thing. So when we consider nuclear weapons, one must always consider the overall security situation. You cannot simply look at nuclear weapons as nuclear weapons and not as components of that larger situation. No country builds nuclear weapons simply to have them. They are tremendously difficult to build and maintain. They are tremendously expensive. No one embarks upon the construction of a nuclear force without a important security reason to do so. The fact is that with the growth in this perception of great power competition, the perception in the world is that the situation is getting worse, that things like nuclear weapons are getting more necessary, that security is somehow less secure. So when I think about this sort of thing, what I want to look at is what are the change factors? What is different now than in the period following the Cold War that is leading to this perception that things are getting worse, that the nuclear danger is growing. So I'm going to illustrate this a little bit with an anecdote that occurred recently. I appeared on a television news program. The subject was security in the Western Pacific region, and I appeared with a Chinese professor. And being a professional diplomat, I spoke very diplomatically about the fact that military confrontation is in no one's interest, that there should be opportunities for dialogue and diplomacy to diffuse tensions, and that it was important that everybody talk to each other a little bit more. My Chinese colleague took a very different approach. He simply said that the reason there is any tension at all in the Western Pacific is because the US is there. That the change driver is US presence and an increased US presence in recent years. And without that, everything would be peaceful and happy and probably not even any typhoons. So to this, I had to respond to say that actually what is changing is the perceptions of China's neighbors, that they are seeing a more aggressive, more militaristic Chinese attitude. And this has led to requests, even demands, for the US to be more present in this region of the world. In the early part of the 21st century, the US withdrew from its former bases in the Philippines. We did this by mutual agreement with the Philippine government, and now the Philippines want us back. That's one example. The US-India relationship is in many ways as good as it has ever been, largely driven by concerns over the Chinese military nationalism. So where does this fit in with nuclear weapons? Well, once again, I look at the change factor, that in this case, China is building more nuclear weapons. If one looks at the overall nuclear weapons in the world, from a peak of something around 70,000 at the end of the Cold War, since then the trend line has been down. Over 80% of all of the nuclear weapons that have ever existed have been eliminated, largely by the US and Russia. The last 2 years or so, that line that represents the total nuclear weapons in the world has suddenly increased just a little bit. But that's China. China is responsible for that entire delta, that entire change in nuclear weapons. So what had been a steady progress towards disarmament is now arrested and is moving in the other, I would say, the wrong direction. So what is going on? What are the drivers? That's the subject for today. I think my colleagues have done a very good job of explaining what these are. I'm not going to repeat what they have said, but I would look at a little bit of history. That traditionally, China's nuclear policy has rested on three very important pillars. The first is the limited deterrence, the minimum deterrence that has been noted earlier, where China has maintained such nuclear weapons that are necessary for deterring and defending Chinese national interests. And China has used this concept that it is much more restrained in its nuclear policy as a propaganda point, and deservedly so. As other countries were building more and more, particularly the US and the Soviet Union, China showed restraint that was not otherwise there. This partnered with the second factor, which was China's economic success. China wanted to be seen as an economic more than a military power in the past. They built a remarkable success story, which was a counter narrative to that of the West, that following China's own system and own methods, it was able to achieve such remarkable economic growth, bring millions up into a middle-class standard of living, and to do this without the emphasis on the military and nuclear weapons was a remarkable success story. Then the third thing was the no first use policy, where China maintained always that it would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. All three of these things are crumbling now. China's economy is under great threat as its demographics are catching up with it, and it is seeing that there is a limit to fueling economic growth through exports while denying imports. The minimum deterrent policy has been cast aside, and now they are following this growth in the nuclear arsenal without transparency as to what the plans are for this. This is tremendously unsettling to China's neighbors. The no first use policy, I've had some discussions with people from the Asia Pacific region who say that they just simply don't believe China is a no first use country anymore, even though the policy is maintained in some form. There are enough indications that Chinese leaders have said that they are willing to take any means possible to prevent Taiwanese independence, for example. This is sometimes interpreted to mean as even nuclear weapons. So the traditional bases for China's nuclear policy are crumbling. And what is the reason for that? Well, at this point, I'm imagining somebody is typing into the chat, isn't this about the US missile defense? Well, no, it's actually not. The US missile defense is built around a limited attack 1s and 2 missiles, accidental launch, a rogue actor getting hold of a nuclear weapon and sending it towards the US or US allies. It is not built around the hundreds of nuclear weapons that China currently has and the greater number that it soon will have. There is nothing in the current US missile defense architecture. So you might say, well, what about the future? Isn't missile defense going to get better? And the answer is yes, it probably will, but not to that degree. The math just doesn't work out. Missile defense calculations normally assume that you need something like 3 interceptors to take down an incoming missile. Well, interceptors are expensive, and there's just not enough money in the GDP to pay for enough of these to take down hundreds of incoming missiles. So it's not about missile defense. The Chinese can do the math as well as anybody else, but that provides a convenient excuse. We can go build more nuclear weapons because of the missile defense, just as US presence in the Western Pacific somehow justifies a more aggressive stance towards neighboring countries. So in calculating what to do, what policy prescriptions that Western countries should follow, we have to deal with this competition between the perception and the reality. We have to understand that China is playing a different game, and we have to concoct a appropriate sort of approach to the great power competition that deals with its actual nature. It is not just a military competition. It is very easy to reduce it to those terms and to say because China is building nuclear weapons, because China is building naval ships, everybody else needs to do the same. But as the previous speaker indicated, an arms race is not really in anyone's interest now. Every government in the world has other priorities and other things to spend money on. There's also a danger that if all of the tools to address the great power competition are military, then that becomes the default course of action. There's an old saying that if the only tool that one has is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Well, the military is a very big hammer, but that's not where the competition actually is. I would argue that the more important level of the competition between China and the West is the intellectual one. It's a competition of ideas. It's a competition of visions for how the world should be ordered. You see this most clearly in the information sphere, where both Western companies and Chinese government are developing the next generation of digital networks. Will that next generation be a tool for the free flow of information and ideas and democratic principles as we in the West would want? Or will it be rather a tool for the government to control such information flows as China would want? This is really the area where we should be competing, because this is what is most important. And this is going to have a tremendous impact on how the world works in the latter half of this century and beyond. Rather than investing purely in military capabilities, Western governments should be investing in diplomacy, in economics, in promoting rules-based international order, in trade regulations, intellectual property, and very important, in information systems. As we do this, this will address the causes of conflict, the causes of tension. That creates the opening where we can then pursue nuclear arms control on a global basis that would include China. Arms control in the past has been too much US, Russia, US, Soviet Union, and somewhat appropriately because those are the largest nuclear arsenals. But as the nuclear numbers come down everywhere else and are going up in China, clearly the arms control problem for the next 100 years is going to be how to prevent Chinese growth in its nuclear weapons from triggering a new arms race. Arms control is a tool that we can use to do this, but it cannot work in a vacuum. It needs that holistic policy approach that I have discussed. So I think I'm going to end my remarks there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, John Erath, very much for that. I think you've answered in a way a previous question we had from Amit Rana as to would China's no first use policy hold good if it came to a conflict over Taiwan. You're thinking that there's more and more speculation that it might not.
I think that China maintains the no first use policy, but at this point it is not generally believed. And that perception is actually what is important here, as other governments will plan their strategies based on the assumption that China would use nuclear weapons.
Yeah. And a question from Philip Bowman, how likely is it that China's nuclear arsenal will one day rival the US or Russian capabilities? I want to focus on that word capability, because you might have your arsenal, but it might not work. And China has not got the experience, even during the Cold War, of the Soviets and the US, or even in fighting wars that America has had. So how likely is it that it will rival the US or Russian capabilities?
US nuclear doctrine is that nuclear weapons are for defense and deterrence. If that holds true for China and Russia as well, as the leaders in January 2022 said it does, then China's arsenal is already sufficient for that defend and deterrent mission. Their capabilities are already there. This is why dialogue on this issue is so important, to get a sense of transparency, to understand what the planning is for the future.
Okay, so the capability is already there. I was going to ask you as a final question before I go round again on a question from the audience, is that we had Matthew Henderson talking about the barrel of a gun, Tong Zhao about sort of part of a process, Amrita Jash said the drivers was status. You've said that they're already at parity or rival. How would you sum up the driver?
I would sum it up in terms of great power competition, but that competition is not purely in the military sense, and that is what is most important to understand.
So you're more with Tong Zhao, for example, is that this is part of a process, and that the nuclear element's part of everything else, rather than the military element that Matthew Henderson laid out.
I think both of them made excellent points, and
you're talking diplomatically again.
I can't help it.
We have a question from the audience that I'd like to go round, beginning with Matthew Henderson again. And we've answered some of these, but this is the question. Syed Ajmal, some time ago, China was not interested to invest in a massive nuclear buildup or deploy the Marines in and around the region because its top political leaders believed the country had other important priorities. But now, what circumstances compelled it to boost its nuclear buildup? We've touched on these points, but sum it up for us, Matthew Henderson.
Their national interests have changed, and that justifies everything, including the new foreign policy law. They have national interests now which expose them to intervention by foreign powers who previously were more powerful than them, and in order to pursue those, they require a powerful response as a deterrent. It is an expansion of their ambition, and it is an all-round ambition. I did not say that it was purely military. I said right at the beginning that this military expansion was absolutely integrated with everything else they're doing in every other aspect of state power as part of their aspiration to being a global superpower.
So in a way, the nuclear buildup is totally linked to the expansion of the Belt and Road, the stealing of technology, and all of the ambitions that it has. It is a part and parcel of that.
There is a closed loop, because that is what they aspire to in order to become the global superpower.
Yeah. And having listened to our distinguished panelists, are you still of the view that we should see China as an enemy?
That is in opposition to the power of the West, and therefore it is by definition a struggle against the West. They wish to supplant the West. They therefore regard the West as the enemy, which they are struggling to defeat. We can regard them in any way we like, but they're behaving because they are like an enemy.
And very interesting. Tong Zhao, how much do you agree there with Matthew Henderson?
I think it has become an enemy in the sense that both sides are actively developing all means possible to compete and undermine each other, including the military domain. But I still think it's important, right, to develop a more sophisticated understanding about the internal perceptions. China doesn't perceive itself as an expansionist power. The problem is deeper in China's increasingly authoritarian system. That system creates exaggerated threat perception and leads to overly aggressive foreign policy and security policy, which is then interpreted by the outside world as China becoming an enemy. So I think a label doesn't convey all the complexities here.
Sorry to interrupt. Who is responsible for this increased polarization, where you have the inevitability in world history of a rising power, but we do not seem to be dealing with it any differently? I think Lord Charles Bruce made the reference to Germany in the early 20th century. We don't seem to have any better solutions for it. Tong Zhao again?
Well, an important changing factor is China itself. China itself has undergone tremendous changes in recent years under its current paramount leadership. China has become a very different country. I lived in that country until recently. It's hard to overstate how dramatic changes internally have taken place within China. I think that contributes greatly to the polarization of major power relations. But that's something I don't think the international community has focuses enough on. But I think the concept of democracy and accountability exactly the most important tool we should use to understand and understand the challenge and hopefully provide some useful solutions.
And just a sort of tangential question before I let you go on this, is because Taiwan has come up a couple of times in this. For the average Chinese citizen, is Taiwan a make or break issue? Is it worth going to war over and all the sacrifices that involves?
The problem is this critical issue is not allowed to be debated within China. You cannot raise questions. You have to say that this is a critical security, this is the core interest of China's core interest, and therefore it's worth defending at all costs. That's the government promoting narrative that no one can raise questions about. That's the fundamental danger of the situation we are facing.
They can't raise questions publicly, but do they think the same as they speak? Do they think we shouldn't do this, or is that not part of an individual's thinking?
Well, even for people to privately convey these thoughts to their friends and close colleagues would carry increasing political risk for themselves. So even private conversation is very hard to take place on those issues.
That's underpinning Matthew Henderson's point there. And Amrita, Jash, getting back to Syed Amjal's question, what are the circumstances that have compelled China to boost its nuclear buildup? Because they weren't that interested in it a few years back.
I'd like to suggest that it's the leadership quotient that counts. Under whom are you seeing this transition? It's because all other factors are very obvious, but when we read China, there's a difference. It becomes very personified, like Mao's China. That gives a characterization. Today we are calling it as Xi Jinping's China, and this build-up, it was not in the previous leadership under Hu Jintao, but here we are seeing a complete different posturing. China is no more. China has taken a departure from Deng Xiaoping's dictum. So China is now ready to show itself, flex its muscles, which was not the case even just 10 years back under the previous administration. So in one word, I'll say leadership. Again, following up or building on from Dr. Tong Chao's thing. What happens The internal dimension is very critical. We often try to look at from the external side, but the domestic factor is very significant when we are reading, especially authoritarian countries like China. It is very important. And leadership, of course, is an obvious choice or the thumb rule.
And tell me, within India itself, is there much debate on how China should be handled as to whether they should go closer to the US or go closer to China?
Of course, India, there is, obvious debates and what India follows in, choosing pragmatically. It's friends and let's say adversaries. Of course, we have made our position very clear with China that we are not going to talk about the overall India-China bilateral relations unless we solve the border. This was not the situation even few years back, but India has become very stringent over this principle. And therefore, we see that Eastern Ladakh dispute is still continuing. We have not been able to resolve that border crisis yet.
And Tong Zhao, if I could bring you back for a second here, is there much debate within China? I know we don't know that much about it, as to how the West should be handled, as to whether Xi Jinping is correct in this aggressive expansionist policy?
Well, I think given the increasing dire situation, the increasing domestic and international challenges faced by China, there must be growing self-reflection in the minds of a growing number of Chinese policy elites and even the ordinary public. But previously, people generally agreed with the mainstream view that it is useless to try to reason with Western countries since they are not really driven by genuine concerns about issues they are criticizing China over, like human rights or domestic governance. They are really trying to achieve the goal of undermining China's growth.
Okay. So there is debate. We might not hear it, but there is genuine debate within the Chinese Communist Party as to what direction to go. John Erath, what is the debate in Washington on how to handle China, particularly since we have the looming elephant of the room of Donald Trump possibly back in the White House?
There is actually a large degree of commonality in terms of the actual policies that are adopted by the Democratic and Republican administration towards China. It's been relatively consistent over time. What changes dramatically is the packaging. When Donald Trump was the president, it was much more inflammatory, much more confrontational. But at the same time, President Trump said that he admired Xi Jinping as a strong leader. So there is perhaps a possibility of a personal connection there. The Biden administration, the policies are relatively unchanged. They continued implementing the export controls on computer chips and things like that. But the packaging is much different. It is an approach where we favor dialogue and talk and building contact across the Pacific. Secretary Blinken has recently returned from yet another trip to China. So the effort at least the forms of establishing dialogue are very much more apparent in the current administration.
Okay, that's very useful. I want to go backwards finally as we go, and I know we've covered it, but let's get it. Give us just 2 or 3 words of what the driver is. We'll go back, John first. Sum that up for us, and then we'll go to Amrita, Tong Zhao, and Matthew again.
The driver is the Chinese attempts to get status through nuclear weapons. And this is being fed by the tendency in the West to look at this as purely a military issue.
Lovely, thank you. Amrita, Jash, the driver?
As already the quest for status has said, I would like to argue that the changing views over deterrence, and which is linked to the changing security environment that China is facing right now.
Thank you. Tong Zhao?
The driver is the increasing political value the Chinese current leadership is attaching to nuclear weapons and the lack of internal checks and balances on it.
Thank you. Matthew Henderson?
Agree with all of the above, but I would say that Taiwan is at the heart of it, because unless China can prove that it is able to get back Taiwan, Xi Jinping will have failed in his personal avowed mission of doing so. That is why he has to have something that will stop anybody else intervening. So he doesn't have to use a nuclear weapon, but he could do, and in the meantime, he will do everything else, and he will succeed in getting Taiwan back.
Thank you very much for that, our panelists. Now, as we draw to the end of our Democracy Forum debate, we bring in the thoughts of our chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, steeped in the history and tension of this part of the world. Barry, what do you make of our discussion?
Humphrey, thank you very much. I want to thank our panel. I think we've heard some very clear answers to the questions, and it's not always that we get clear answers to the questions that we pose, but I think we actually did today. It doesn't mean they all agreed, but there were very clear answers. Let me try and start off going chronologically through the presentations, and then maybe to try and draw out some themes that I think were really important. Charles, Lord Bruce began talking about that abandonment of the minimum nuclear capacity, that ability to make a minimum response. He talked about the expansion, gave statistics to back that up, and talked of it as one of the, or actually quoted the US as saying it was one of the largest shifts in geostrategic shifts in history. Likened it, as you mentioned later, to the pre-World War I phase with Germany, that great power drive. And he said that each side had convinced itself that the other is a strategic danger. And this kept on reappearing throughout the panelist discussion. What is each's perception of the other, and is it a correct perception, or is it a misconception? And here I would jump straight to John Erath and what he said. We have to deal with the difference between appearance and reality. This is such a great Shakespearean theme that it's difficult to resist. You look at any of the great Shakespeare plays, and that is at the core of it. It's at the core of human conflict. What is appearance? What is reality? You know, in law, what pleas so tainted and corrupt, but being seasoned with a gracious voice, obscures the show of evil. I think that was how it was put in The Merchant of Venice. And there we have this, no, we don't intend any first use. Well, do you or don't you? This was one of the central questions that people kept on coming back to and expressing doubt about. I thought the other interesting point that Charles made was the driver to seek nuclear parity only works in a bipolar, not in a, I think the word has to be tripartite rather than tripolar world. I don't think you can have tripoles, but maybe you can. Now, Matthew gave perhaps what was the most robust, don't be fooled, this is pure evil response, if one was to put it into Shakespearean terms. And at the end there, he said simply, look, this is about Taiwan. It is about Greater China. It is about getting back what China believes is rightfully hers, whether that be Taiwan, whether it be in Russia, the Manchurian part of Russia, whether it be Ladakh. This is about China taking what it feels is rightfully hers and doing it not necessarily through military force itself, but certainly through the threat of it. He set out a context, he set out core issues. He talked about the build-up disrupts global stability and threatens democracy throughout the world. Yeah, threatens democracy throughout the world. It would certainly threaten democracy in Taiwan. I didn't feel he backed up his assertion that it threatened democracy throughout the world. Now we all know the nostrum, injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. But I think if one looks at this, as I think some of our other panelists did, from a more Chinese-based perspective, in fact, I was talking with somebody this morning who just come back from China, who said that they said, look, we are a people who are basically rural. We want our own house, and that wanting our own house means we don't want anybody else's house, but we do want what we believe to be our own house, and we want things to be done in our own house in the way that we believe is our own way. Now, I'm certainly not saying that that gives them any right to do what people have feared in terms of Taiwan, but it does give you a different sense of where they're coming from. And if we don't understand where they're coming from, then it's very difficult to build up the trust to pierce that veil of appearance and get to the reality if we don't do that. He talked about, one of the interesting things Matthew mentioned was in 1950, US military recommended bombing China, nuclear bombing China, to stop them taking Taiwan in due course. Now, Matthew, I don't want to put words in your mouth, certainly not on this, but it almost seemed as if you thought they were right in the 1950s, and it might have been better had they done so. So there was just a question mark over what if that is indeed what the US military believed in the 1950s, I would say that should make us much more concerned about the way in which the US military were making those suggestions, rather than the fact that we could have perhaps prevented something that hasn't yet happened 70 years later. Russian cooperation building nuclear capacity, I think, was a very important point that he made. And also China's influence in Pakistan and North Korea, and brought that whole family of nuclear capabilities in a potentially adverse way together. He also spoke of China's contempt for rules and norms. And there I was thinking, well, we're expecting China to adhere to a policy of no first use, because that's historically what they stated. But of course, it's not a policy that we ourselves have been prepared to sign up to. So again, there's an issue of, if you're talking about international rules and norms, they really do have to be genuinely accepted internationally. But to be asking of an adversary, and I don't use the word enemy, but adversary, certainly, that they sign up to a rule that you're not prepared to sign up to, is perhaps not a cause that you can then complain about them not adhering to those rules. He spoke of the worsening political relations, turbocharging mistrust, and of Taiwan as the dangerous flashpoint to global democracy. Now, Zhao again spoke of the internal drivers, not on the technical, the external front. Gave the figures on the arsenal doubling, but pointed out that that was from about 200 to 400. But their threat capacity was blunted by Western technical capabilities in terms of missile defense and space defense system. And he focused on the political driver and status, an important source of international status. I wrote down at that point, nuclear is about who we are, not what we want to do to you. Seemed to be the message that was coming over here about how China saw its own position and its actions. Not as an enemy, but certainly as a competitor and a potential adversary. He talked about the power gap between the US and China narrowing, and now being seen obviously as a very serious economic rival to the USA. And of course, in that context, the West wanting to preserve its dominance, to slow China's growth, to disrupt its capacity to get economic dominance. And China's view, he pointed out, was that all the stuff that the West talked about, that we believe in terms of human rights and democracy, whether that be, with the Uyghurs or whether it be in Taiwan, he said that within China, that is seen simply as the West wanting to put barriers to slow the growth of China, to this containment agenda that the West has. So the strategic capability is about shaping the West's perception of China and that containment agenda. He spoke of the drivers of being fear and ambition. Fear threatening internal stability, and ambition to disabuse the West that they can be contained. I thought that was a very interesting point. And again, it goes back to this: how do you perceive yourself? Who are we as China? And how can we persuade you that we're not to be contained in the way that you wish, that we're not pushover that you think we might be? I thought Amrita, Jash, brought in that really important thread of what is a credible deterrence, that changing understanding of what constituted a credible deterrence to other adversaries such as the USA, and she rightly pointed out, and India. And she said, here, hence there was the change in no first use. Again, spoke of ambition. There, I think she very much agreed with the line that Tong Zhao had propagated, and talked about strength being about status. Status in that China wants to be recognized as a major power, and nuclear strength is part of how China sees that status can be achieved. She spoke of the 2015, the way in which they designated the rocket force on equal status to other military. And I thought at the end there, interestingly, when she spoke about leadership and the way in which the Chinese projection of itself had changed with successive political leaders. And she said how to respond, or maybe I put this in the margins, how to respond without raising tensions, give status, it seems to me. It was very interesting this morning. I don't know if many of you heard George Robertson, the former executive secretary of NATO, on the radio, on Radio 4. He was talking about his encounters with Putin and with Russia back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Russia had said that they wanted to be invited to join NATO. To which his response, well, no, we don't invite people, but people in countries make applications. And Russia's response at that point, he said, was, we cannot stand in a queue waiting to be admitted to an organization like NATO. I thought that was very interesting, because again, it goes to this understanding of how one perceives one's own country, the status that one believes one ought to have. And I think George was expressing there a sense that perhaps we'd missed a trick in not affording greater status to Russia during that period after its very turbulent history with Yeltsin and the changeover. It had all gone sour. Well, I hope we don't miss the same trick with China by a refusal to accord status. Now, John spoke very clearly about not seeing China purely in military terms, because that leads us to look at military solutions. The great power competition, indeed, yes, there is, but also great power cooperation. And I think it's really important, the focus that he put on that cooperation that exists between the US industry and China at the moment. He talked about the importance of constant contact, crisis of security, the perception that things are getting worse. China's view that tension in the Western Pacific is because the US is there. The US's view that actually the tension is because China's neighbors are getting worried about, its increasing dominance and projection of its own power. And he spoke of the three pillars which were crumbling: the minimum deterrence, China's economic success, and the no first use policy, all of which he said were beginning to crumble. I go back, I think, to what he said about we have to deal with the difference between appearance and reality. We know that face in China, status in China, the whole business about not losing face is so very important in that culture. And therefore, that question that he posed, dealing with the difference between appearance and reality, is China adopting the Lady Macbeth maxim, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it? Who knows? There is no vice so simple, but assumes some mark of virtue as its outward parts. With China, I think it's really important that we really get to the reality of what is there, and don't get confused by the appearance.
Thank you, Barry. But whilst we have you there, can I just ask you quickly whether there's a blade of grass to be put between the current British government's policy on what we've been discussing and the policy of the Labour Party, which might be in power in a year's time?
With respect to China and its nuclear policy?
Well, with respect to what we in Britain might do on this whole issue, is it because we've heard Matthew's view and other views here? Where do you and the potential Labour government sit on that?
Okay, but look, let me take the two halves of your question. I don't believe that the government, as such, the governing party certainly, has a coherent policy. It was only 7 years ago, not even that we had the golden era of UK-China relations. We have a number of treaties with China, whether that's in broadcasting, in other matters, which we're not actually utilizing at the moment, because those relationships have soured as badly as they have. There are different strands within the Conservative Party, that some that would wish to see China very much, in Matthew's terms, as an enemy that needs to be contained. Others that might say, well, let's see if by piercing through the appearance that we can get to the core of what China's needs are and get this organized, a future relationship with China in a way that is within the rules-based system. I would certainly prefer to see us take an approach that is ultimately based on cooperation, cajoling, but not disrespect. And I think the mistake that we often make is when we make an enemy of somebody, we disrespect them, we turn them into an enemy. Much as I was saying, George was talking about Russia earlier today. I think it's important we don't make that mistake again, and we need to understand what China feels its own domestic status requires. That's not a council of appeasement. It's a council of realistic engagement. And I certainly hope that what I heard of what John was saying and his approach to that, yes, let us be cautious, let us not be fooled, but actually let us see this in that wider context where we are a global community that has to resolve these differences together, and see it in the context of the wider trading relationships and other strategic relationships that we have.
Thank you for that, Barry. We are over time. Otherwise, I would be tempted to bring Matthew and John and the others back into that, but we have to leave it there. And we've covered the ground, and I think we've nailed the drivers. Matthew Henderson, Tong Zhao, Amrita Jash, and John Erath, thank you very much. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for skillfully giving us the backdrop of our debate. And thank you, Barry. Read more about all these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, which goes deeply into these things that most publications do not. Our next debate is Tuesday, September the 26th, Impact of the Internet on Democracy, Positive Tool or Polarizing Force. Now there's a discussion to be had. Join us then at the usual time of 2 p.m. Until then, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum, thank you very much for being here, and until next month, goodbye.
Yeah.